The notice was printed on official city letterhead, and it was the third one in 4 months, and the man holding it had the practiced patience of someone who had done this many times before. He stood on Dora Keswick's porch on a Tuesday morning in October, with a document extended in his gloved hand, and behind him a second inspector stood near the wrought iron gate, and behind that man, half a block down Alderman Street, a sheriff's deputy sat in an idling cruiser with his window cracked 2 inches against the cold. The notice said that the property at 14 Alderman Street had been found in violation of Municipal Code Sections 18.4, 22.7, and 31.1, and that the homeowner had 30 days to remediate or face condemnation proceedings. Dora looked at the paper for a long moment. She did not take it. "You can slide it under the door," she said. "I'm not home." The inspector blinked. Dora closed the door. She stood in her front hallway with her back against the wood and her hands folded together at her waist, the arthritis in her knuckles burning the way it always did in cold weather, and she listened to the man's footsteps cross the porch and descend the 3 worn steps to the sidewalk. Through the narrow side window, she watched him fold the notice twice and push it through the mail slot. She heard it land on the hardwood at her feet. She did not look down at it for a very long time. Dora Keswick was 74 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she had lived at 14 Alderman Street for 41 years. She had raised 2 children in the house's 4 small bedrooms and kept a garden in the narrow side yard every summer since 1986, and paid property taxes without a late notice in 4 decades. She had buried her husband Hank out of this house 6 years ago, and she had kept his workshop in the basement exactly as he left it, the tools hung on their pegboard outlines, his work boots standing beneath the workbench as if he had just stepped out and intended to come back. She worked part-time at the county library, cataloging periodicals 2 mornings a week because she liked the quiet and because it got her out of the house before the silence became something with weight and shape. Hank Keswick had been a veteran and a patient man who fixed other people's engines for 30 years at his own small garage on Delmar Road, and who had, for as long as Dora knew him, harbored a quiet and unspoken longing for a motorcycle he never bought. He would stop on sidewalks to look at them. He would read the specifications in magazines he kept stacked beside the armchair. He knew the displacement and the torque ratings of machines he had never ridden and never owned, and he never said a word about wanting one, because there had always been something more pressing the money needed to do. After the children were grown and the garage was paid off and the money might finally have allowed it, Hank got sick, and then he got sicker, and then he was gone. That was the thing about a life lived carefully. You could do everything right and still run out of time. Dora started putting flowers on the motorcycle 3 weeks before the third notice arrived. She had not planned it. She had been walking past Crane's Hardware on a Tuesday morning with a bag of library books to return when she saw it parked at the curb, a 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead in black and chrome, battered and road-scarred and magnificent. It was the kind of machine Hank had described to her once in a voice so quiet she had thought he was talking to himself. She stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk looking at it for what was probably a full minute, and something in her chest did something complicated and unresolvable. And then she walked to the little flower cart at the corner and bought 3 stems of wildflowers with her library book change and came back and laid them against the handlebars. She told herself it was a strange thing to do. She did it again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. On the 4th Tuesday, she was crouched at the front wheel of the shovelhead, arranging a small bunch of late-season black-eyed Susans, when a voice above her said, very quietly, "Ma'am?" She looked up. The man standing beside her was enormous. He stood 6'4" in work boots, and he wore a leather-cut vest over a black flannel shirt. And his gray beard was full and neatly kept, and his forearms, which were the size of architectural columns, carried sleeve tattoos from wrist to collar. The patch on the back of his vest said Iron-Packed MC, and below that, Riverside, and the patch on his chest said President. A scar ran through his left eyebrow in a pale diagonal line. His eyes were gray and careful and entirely without threat in that moment, which was itself a kind of threat, because a man who could afford to be still like that was a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. "That's my bike," he said. Dora straightened up with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had decided long ago that embarrassment was a luxury she could not afford. "I know that," she said. "I'm sorry for the presumption." The man looked at the black-eyed Susans against his chrome for a moment. "My name's Rex," he said. "Dora Keswick," she said. "I live on Alderman Street." Rex looked at her for a long moment. The October wind moved between them. "You want to tell me why you've been leaving flowers on my bike for a month?" So she told him. She told him about Hank and the magazines and the quiet voice describing the shovelhead's displacement, the way another man might describe a cathedral. She told him about the library books and the flower cart, and the impulse she could not explain except to say that it felt like finishing something that had never gotten finished. She said it plainly and without apology and without asking him to feel anything about it, because she had not done it for anyone but herself and Hank, and she was not going to perform grief for a stranger's benefit. Rex listened without speaking. When she was done, he said, "How long has your husband been gone?" 6 years this January." He nodded once. Then he said, "What's on the third notice?" Dora looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You said you live on Alderman Street." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small card, plain white with a handwritten address. "Someone's been working that block. We've heard about it." He held the card out. "Code violations?" She took the card slowly. "3 of them," she said. "The last one gives me 30 days. Rex said nothing for a moment. His gray eyes moved down the street and back. "That address," he said, nodding at the card in her hand. "It's a bar, the Iron Rail, on Clement Avenue. You come by when you're ready." He picked up the flowers from the handlebars and held them for a moment before laying them carefully inside the saddlebag, which was not a thing Dora expected. "I'll tell them you're coming." He did not wait for her answer. He swung onto the shovelhead and rolled away from the curb, and the engine sound settled into her sternum and stayed there for a long time after the bike had turned the corner and disappeared. Dora stood on the sidewalk for a while. Then she walked home and sat at the kitchen table with the card on the cloth in front of her and drank her coffee while it went cold. She thought about Hank. She thought about what Hank would have said about the card and the address and the enormous man with the gray beard and the scarred eyebrow. She decided Hank would have said, "Well, you've tried everything else?" She went on the following Thursday. The Iron Rail sat on Clement Avenue between a tire shop and a vacant lot, and its exterior gave nothing away except age and purpose. The windows were painted black from the inside, and the door was solid steel, painted the same matte black as the wall, and the only indication that it was a door at all was the handle, which was a length of polished motorcycle chain welded to the frame. A row of Harleys lined the curb out front, 12 of them minimum, chrome catching the gray afternoon light. Dora parked her sedan at the end of the row and sat in the driver's seat for 30 seconds, looking at the door. She was afraid. She knew enough about fear to know that it did not go away by waiting, so she got out of the car. The man who opened the door to her knock was younger and shorter than Rex, with a shaved head and a barrel chest, and a jaw that looked like it had been shaped by repeated conversation with harder objects. His leather cut said, Sergeant at Arms. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has arrived in the wrong place through no particular malice of its own. Keswick, he said. Yes, she said. He stepped back and let her in. The inside of the iron rail smelled of old wood, machine oil, and cigarette smoke, and it was larger than its exterior suggested, with a long bar running the length of the left wall and half a dozen round tables filling the floor. Maybe 20 men occupied the space, most of them in leather cuts, some at the bar and some at tables, and 3 standing along the back wall with their arms folded. The noise level dropped when she walked in, not to silence, but to a considered quiet, the kind of quiet that means people are paying attention without wanting to seem like they are. Dora walked to the nearest empty stool at the bar and sat down. A man behind the bar, young, with a goatee, looked at her. Drink? Coffee, she said. Black, please. Rex emerged from a door at the back of the bar and walked toward her with the unhurried motion of a man who had appointed himself to a task and intended to see it finished. He sat on the stool beside her and put his heavy forearms on the bar and looked at her without preamble. Tell me what's happened, he said. From the beginning. So she did. She told him about the first notice, which cited a foundation crack that a licensed contractor had inspected and found non-existent. She told him about the second notice, which cited substandard wiring in a house that had been rewired 8 years ago with permits on file. She told him about the third notice, which cited 3 separate code violations in a 40-day inspection report that had been signed by an inspector she had never seen and dated from a week when she had been in the house every single day. She told him about the letter from Voss Property Partners that had arrived 2 weeks after the first notice offering to purchase the property for $90,000, nearly $250,000 less than the county's own assessed value. She told him about Nora Lindqvist next door, who was 80 years old, and had received an identical sequence of notices and an identical letter, and who had no family and no savings, and who cried every night now, which Dora knew because their kitchen windows faced each other across 6 feet of garden fence. She told him all of it in the same level tone she had used on the sidewalk, without trembling and without asking for his sympathy, because she had learned in the last 4 months that sympathy was the thing most readily offered and least practically useful. When she finished, Rex was quiet for a moment. The man with the shaved head, the sergeant-at-arms, had drifted closer during her account and was now leaning against the bar 3 feet away, with his arms crossed, listening with an expression that had moved in increments she could not have specified, from skepticism to something harder and colder. Rex said, Garrett Voss. It was not a question. Dora nodded. He's been running this on 4 blocks in the east side, Rex said, not to her, but to the room. He looked at the sergeant-at-arms. Wrench. I heard, Wrench said. His voice was flat and precise. Milo. From the back table, a lanky young man with a laptop already open looked up. On it, he said. Dora looked between them. On what, specifically? Rex turned back to her. The inspection reports are forged, he said. We don't know it yet, but we will in about 2 hours. Voss has a man inside the city inspections office. Has had one for 2 years. We've been watching the pattern, but we didn't have the thread. He looked at her steadily. You just gave us the thread. Dora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The arthritis ached. She held on anyway. What happens with the thread? She said. Rex's expression did not change. 30 days is what the notice says, he said. You have 30 days. We'll be faster than that. The shaved-headed sergeant, Wrench, pushed off the bar and walked to the back table where Milo worked. Dora watched the two men lean over the laptop together. The bar's ambient noise returned, low and functional. Someone put money in the jukebox, and a low Waylon Jennings track eased through the room. She sat with her coffee and thought about Hank's workbench and the boots beneath it, and decided that she had made the right choice coming here. Or at least the only choice that had any chance of amounting to something. She was wrong about the 30 days, though. Not in the way she feared. 4 days passed, then 3 more passed. Milo called Rex from his apartment at 2 in the morning on the 7th day, and Rex drove to the iron rail and sat with him for 6 hours in the back booth, while Milo's laptop ran through property records and city contract databases and shell company registrations and the inspection department's internal work order logs. By morning, they had the shape of it. A city inspector named Russ Parkle had filed 41 inspection reports in 18 months on properties along 4 specific blocks. 37 of those reports cited violations. 34 of those properties had subsequently received purchase offers from entities that, traced through 2 and then 3 corporate layers, resolved to a holding company called Meridian Land Partners, whose sole beneficial owner was the brother-in-law of Garrett Voss. Voss himself sat on the City Council's Infrastructure Committee, which had approved every rezoning request Meridian had filed. The city inspector's personal bank account had received 31 payments over 22 months from a payroll service registered to Meridian. It was not complicated, as these things went. It was just the kind of arrangement that survived entirely on the assumption that the people being squeezed were too alone and too afraid to know where to look. Rex called Dora at 9 in the morning. "We have the documents," he said. All of them. The inspector, the shell company, the transfers." Dora was sitting at her kitchen table with a third notice spread flat in front of her. She had been looking at it for an hour. "What do you do with documents like that?" she asked. "We sit on them," Rex said. "Until Voss does something stupid." He did not elaborate on what stupid looked like or how long it would take. Dora folded the notice into thirds and put it in the kitchen drawer and went to work at the library. She cataloged periodicals for 2 hours on Thursday morning and came home to find Nora Lindqvist standing in the garden between their houses in her housecoat, which was a sign of distress because Nora was particular about being dressed before appearing outside. Nora's face was the color of old candle wax, and she was holding her cell phone in both hands the way people held things when they needed something to grip. "They came back," Nora said. 2 of them, and a deputy. "They said your house, too." Her voice had the fragile, even quality of someone who has decided the only way to keep from crying is to speak in a precise monotone. "They left a notice on your door, a different one. It says condemned." Dora looked at the folded paper wedged in the crack of her front door. She did not go to it immediately. She looked at Nora instead, who was 79 and who had no family, and who had been a good neighbor for 32 years, who had brought Dora soup when Hank was dying, and who had knocked on Dora's kitchen window on the day of the funeral, and silently handed through a plate of shortbread, and then gone back to her own house without asking for anything. Dora put her arm around Nora's thin shoulders and said, "Go inside. I have to make a phone call." She called Rex while she was still standing in the garden. She told him what Nora had said. There was a pause on Rex's end, short and complete. "They moved early," he said. His voice was very level. "That means Voss is coming himself. He wouldn't send the inspectors back with a condemnation unless he planned to be there to receive the property." "How do you know that?" Dora said. "Because that's how men like that work," Rex said. "They like to watch it land." A second pause. "Don't go anywhere. Don't open the door if anyone knocks. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. Dora went inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and looked through the window at Nora's kitchen window across the garden fence, where a light came on in the dimness of the overcast morning. 22 minutes after she hung up, Rex called back. "How many bikes can fit on Alderman Street?" he said. Dora thought about the narrow residential block, the parked cars on both sides, the ginkgo trees dropping yellow leaves on the pavement. "More than you'd think," she said. "It's a long block." "Good," Rex said. "Stay home. We'll be there at 2. He said it the way a man says he'll be somewhere at 2 when he means the word we, in a very specific and non-negotiable sense. Dora noted the tone and put the tea on, and spent the next 3 hours doing what she always did when she was afraid, which was to clean things that were already clean and organize things that were already organized. And when she had exhausted those options, she sat in Hank's armchair in the front room and watched the street through the window. They came at 14 minutes past 2. She heard them before she saw them, the sound building from the direction of Clement Avenue, low and collective and rhythmic, a rumble that was not one engine but many engines speaking the single language. It came up the block like weather coming in, like the pressure change before a storm, and Dora sat in the armchair with her hands folded on her knees and felt it in the floor beneath her feet. The first bike appeared at the top of the block, and then the second, and then they were coming continuously, a column of them turning off Clement and filling the narrow street, leather cuts and chrome and exhaust smoke rising against the gray October sky, and they pulled to the curb with the practiced ease of people who had done this formation many times before and killed their engines one after another in a ripple that ran down the block and ended in a silence that was somehow louder than the noise had been. Dora counted 31 bikes. Rex dismounted from the shovelhead and stood on the sidewalk in front of her house with his arms at his sides, and Wrench stood beside him, and behind them the full chapter stood at their bikes in the cold afternoon light. None of them moving, all of them watching the street with the unhurried patience of people who had nowhere else to be and no particular interest in pretending otherwise. Dora came out of her house. Rex looked at her when she came down the porch steps. He said quietly enough that only she could hear it. "He's 6 blocks away. Parked his car at the lot on Sutter Street. He's walking." He looked back up the block. "He'll want to see the condition of the property before the condemnation paperwork finalizes. They always check the property in person." "And when he gets here," Dora said. "He gets a conversation," Rex said. Dora stood on the sidewalk in front of her house of 41 years and listened to the cold wind moving through the ginkgo trees and dropping leaves on the chrome of 31 motorcycles. And she was afraid, and she was also, for the first time in 4 months, not alone. Nora's front door opened, and Nora came out onto her porch, in a proper wool coat now, buttoned to the collar, looking at the assembled men with the wide, careful eyes of someone calculating the geometry of an extraordinary situation, and finding the math came out in her favor. She descended her steps and came to stand beside Dora without saying anything. Dora took her hand. Garrett Voss came around the corner at the top of Alderman Street at 2:27 in the afternoon, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat and carrying a leather portfolio. He was 52, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the kind of man who had spent decades in rooms where his physical size and the quality of his clothing were sufficient armor against most things that could be said to him. He turned onto the block with the confident stride of someone who expected the street to arrange itself around his intentions, and then he stopped walking. He stood at the top of the block and looked at 31 motorcycles and 31 leather cuts and 33 people, counting Dora and Nora standing in the cold afternoon light in front of numbers 14 and 16 Alderman Street. His portfolio came down slightly in his grip, an involuntary small motion. His face went through 3 expressions in quick succession, and the third one, when it settled, was the composed professional face of a man trying to remember what composed professionals do when they encounter things their calculations did not include. He started walking again. Rex did not move from the sidewalk. He watched Voss come down the block with the same gray-eyed patience he had shown on the sidewalk outside Crane's Hardware, and when Voss was 20 feet away, Rex said, in a voice that carried through the cold air without effort and without elevation, "Mr. Voss." Voss stopped. He was 6 feet tall, and he was looking up at Rex anyway, and that small arithmetic seemed to cost him something. He looked at the assembled chapter, and then back at Rex, and then at Dora and Nora standing together. "What is this?" he said. It came out as a statement rather than a question, which was the verbal habit of a man who had decided a long time ago that asking questions in public was a concession he could not afford. "This is Alderman Street," Rex said, "and you're here without a welcome." "I have an official condemnation notice," Voss said. He opened his portfolio and produced a document and held it forward, the gesture of a man accustomed to paper being a kind of force field. Rex did not look at the document. He said, "Russ Parkle." Voss went still. Voss went, 41 reports, Rex said. 37 violations, Meridian Land Partners, your brother-in-law's signature on the LLC filing. 31 payments, the last one 9 days ago. Rex's voice had the quality of a man reciting facts he found neither interesting nor surprising, just accurate and complete. The account routing numbers, the payroll service registration, the timeline of zoning approvals against your infrastructure committee votes. He paused for one beat. "We have all of it." The cold air moved between them. One of the ginkgo trees dropped a handful of yellow leaves onto the street. Voss looked at the document in his own hand. Something in his face was undergoing a change that had nothing to do with expression, and everything to do with a fundamental recalculation of what was possible. He looked at Dora. His mouth opened slightly. "Those are serious accusations," he said, and his voice had lost 2 of the 3 registers it had carried 30 seconds ago. What was left was thin and careful. "They're not accusations," Rex said. "They're records, filed documents, bank records, inspection department logs." He looked at Voss without any particular feeling. "Your inspector is going to talk, Mr. Voss. He talked to us last night. He's going to talk to a great many other people in the next 48 hours. This was the thing that Voss had not understood when he built his arrangement. That the men he had been invisible to, the working-class residents of these blocks, the ones without lawyers and without connections and without access to the rooms where decisions were made, some of those people had their own rooms. Different rooms. Rooms where the rules were different and the reach was longer and the interest in protecting the vulnerable was genuine and total and not subject to appeal through channels that money could navigate. Voss closed his portfolio. The movement was careful and deliberate. The movement of a man putting something away that he understood he would not be opening again in this context. He looked at the assembled chapter. He looked at Dora. She met his eyes. She did not speak. There was nothing she needed to say to him that the street had not already said. "The condemnation notices," Rex said, still without elevation, still patient. "All 4 blocks. You're going to have them formally withdrawn by Monday morning. Russ Parkle is going to file corrected inspection reports on every property he falsified. Every purchase offer from Meridian or any Meridian-adjacent entity is permanently rescinded." Rex tilted his head slightly, a single degree of movement. "You're going to do these things because you've now considered the alternative, and you found it unsuitable." Voss's jaw tightened once. It was the last controlled gesture he made. Then his shoulders moved. A small, involuntary drop, and he turned and walked back up Alderman Street toward Sutter Street and his parked car, with the careful walk of a man who knows he is being watched and has decided that carriage is the only dignity he has left. Wrench watched him go. He said, without turning his head, "He'll lawyer up." Rex said, "Good. His lawyers will look at what Milo has, and they'll tell him to do exactly what we said." He looked at Dora. "Park'll already agreed. He'll file corrected reports because the alternative for him is federal mail fraud. He knows that." Dora watched Voss reach the corner and turn without looking back. She felt the 4 months of notices and the 6 years of silence and the 41 years of a house paid for with careful work, all of it resolving in the cold October air into something clean and specific and final. Her hands were shaking slightly, which was not fear anymore. She was not entirely sure what it was. Nora squeezed her hand once and let go. Rex looked at Dora with his gray eyes and said, "He'll get quiet. The development deal is dead without those properties, and he knows the documents exist. He doesn't know exactly where they are or how many copies." A trace of something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but a very close neighbor to one. "He'll stay quiet," Dora said. "What about the next time? Not him, but the next one." Rex was quiet for a moment. Down the block, his chapter stood at their bikes in the late afternoon light, patient and still, their leather cuts catching the gray sky. He said, "This address, Alderman Street. People will know it's our street now." He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a geographic fact. That tends to settle those questions. Dora looked at the 31 bikes lining the curb. She thought about Hank and the shovelhead specifications and the magazines stacked beside the armchair. She thought about what Hank would have made of this afternoon, of 31 motorcycles parked outside their house, and a city councilman walking away with his portfolio empty and his arrangements destroyed. She thought he would have found it extremely interesting and probably said very little about it, which had been his way. "Come inside," she said. And she said it to Rex and to Wrench and to the young man Milo who had appeared at the edge of the group. And she said it the way a person says it when they are not asking but offering, which is a different register entirely. Rex looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Wrench, "Tell them to give it an hour." He looked back at Dora. "Lead the way." In her kitchen, Dora made coffee and found the shortbread she kept in the tin above the refrigerator and put it on the table, and Rex and Wrench and Milo sat in her kitchen with their leather cuts and their tattoos and their careful economies of speech, while the rest of the chapter stood on Alderman Street in the cold and the afternoon moved toward evening. Nora came through the garden gate and knocked, and Dora let her in, and Nora sat down at the table and immediately began asking Milo questions about his laptop in a direct and technically precise way that suggested she had worked with computers at some point in her professional life, which Dora had not known. The kitchen smelled of coffee and shortbread and the particular quality of October coming through the window over the sink. Wrench was quiet for most of it, but at some point during the second round of coffee, he looked at the photographs on Dora's kitchen wall, the ones she had arranged in a cluster above the calendar. Hank at the garage, Hank at the backyard grill, Hank and Dora at their oldest daughter's wedding with the big Midwestern sky behind them, and a photograph that Dora had framed because it captured something true. Hank crouched beside a Harley, in a parking lot somewhere, not his bike, someone else's, just looking at it with the absorbed attention of a man examining something genuinely beautiful. Wrench said, to no one in particular, "He never rode?" He ran out of time, Dora said. Wrench nodded once. He looked at the photograph for another moment and then looked down at his coffee cup and said nothing more. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed by a small but definite degree. Rex was the last to stand up. He pushed back his chair and looked at Dora across the kitchen table and said, "Monday morning, the withdrawal notices will be filed. You'll have copies by Monday afternoon." He looked at the kitchen, the window, the garden fence, the narrow side yard where the last of the season's plants had gone brown and flat. He said, "You should plant what you want next spring. No one's going to bother this house." Dora looked at him. "That's a large promise," she said. "Yes," he said. He said it without qualification or addendum, which was itself the addendum. She walked them out through the front door and stood on the porch, while Rex and Wrench and Milo crossed the sidewalk to the bikes. Down the block, the chapter was beginning to move, mounting up, engines starting in a sequence that built itself from scattered to collective, a sound like a paragraph coming to its final sentence. Rex swung onto the shovel head and looked back at her from the seat. "Mrs. Keswick," he said. "Rex," she said. He reached into his cut and held something out. She walked down the porch steps and took it. It was a key on a plain ring, unmarked. She looked at it in her palm. "The iron rail," he said. "You want coffee that isn't yours, you come by." He paused for one beat. "You're on our list now. That means something." Dora closed her hand around the key. It was warm from his pocket. "I know what it means," she said. He nodded once and turned back to the street and rolled forward, and the chapter fell in behind him, a long column of machines moving through the late afternoon light in the order of people who have places to be and know how to get there, and the sound went with them down the block and around the corner, and then diminished through the streets of the city until it was gone. Nora stood at the gate in the garden fence with her wool coat buttoned. The street was quiet and ordinary again, and the ginkgo leaves were gold on the pavement. Nora said, "Well." "Yes," Dora said. "Yes." She stood on her porch of 41 years and held the key in her right hand and looked at the empty street where 31 motorcycles had stood, and felt something she recognized after a moment as the feeling of a thing that had been left unfinished for a long time, finally having its last piece set in place. Not grief resolved, because grief did not resolve, but grief accommodated. Made room for alongside something new. She went inside and moved through the kitchen to the basement door and down the stairs to Hank's workshop. She stood in the familiar dark smell of machine oil and sawdust and turned on the workbench light, his tools on their pegboard, his boots beneath the bench, everything where he left it. She picked up the key and set it on the corner of the workbench beside the boots, where she would see it every time she came down. Then she went back upstairs and into the kitchen and found in the cabinet above the sink the small terracotta pot she had been keeping empty for no reason she could have articulated. And she brought it to the table and sat down and thought about what she would plant in it when the time was right. The kitchen was warm. The afternoon light lay long across the floor. Somewhere 6 blocks away on Clement Avenue, the iron-packed chapter was pulling into the lot at the iron rail and cutting their engines in the settling dusk. And the city was doing what cities did, absorbing this afternoon back into the ordinary run of things, except for the parts that would not be absorbed, the parts that would stay changed, which were the parts that mattered. Dora put her hands around the empty pot and felt the October cold still on the terracotta, and thought about what would come up from it in April. What color, what root, and what the garden would look like from the window when spring came again to Alderman Street. She was free. She had been free for an hour and had not let herself feel it yet, and now she did, quietly, in her kitchen, the way a person feels the things that are most true to them, without audience and without announcement. just the simple, specific weight of it in her chest, alongside everything else that lived there. The marigolds, she decided. Marigolds, because they were tough, and because they bloomed long into the season, and because Hank had always liked the way they smelled in the morning, when the dew was still on them, a clean green bite of scent that meant summer, that meant the yard, that meant home. She set the pot in the window where it would catch the light. If this story settled something in you today, something about what loyalty looks like when it comes from the people you least expected, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below about a time someone showed up for you when the odds were stacked. And if you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell. There are more of them. We'll see you on the next one.